The beaver, past and present. All Indian tribes in North America appear to have had one or more legends concerning the beaver. Most of these legends credit him with being a worthy and industrious fellow, and the Cherokees are said to trace their origin to a sacred and practical beaver. Many of the tribes had a legend which told that long, long ago the great waters surged around a shoreless world. These waters were peopled with beaver of a gigantic size. These, along with the Great Spirit, dived and brought up quantities of mud and shaped this into the hills and dales, the mountains where the cataracts plunged and sang, and all the caves and canyons. The scattered boulders and broken crags upon the earth were the missiles thrown by evil spirits, who in the beginning of things endeavored to hinder and prevent the constructive work of creation. The beaver has been found in fossil both in Europe and in America. Remnants of the dugout and the teeth of beaver, together with rude stone implements of primitive man, have been found in England. Near Albany, New York, gnawed beaver wood and the remains of a mastodon were dug up from about 40 feet below the surface in sediment and river ooze. Fossil beaver were of enormous size. Coming down to comparatively modern times, the animal as we now know him appears to have been distributed over almost all Asia, Europe, and North America. There was no marked difference in the individuals that inhabited these three continents. The beaver is probably extinct in Europe, but in July 1900 I found a piece of wood floating in the Seine that had been recently gnawed by a beaver. At this time, I was assured that not even a tame beaver could be found in Europe. It is still found in parts of Siberia and Central Asia. That form which inhabits South America is very unlike those in the northern hemisphere, and may be called a link between the muskrat and the beaver. Reference is made to the beaver in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, and Herodotus makes repeated mention of it. Pliny also gives a brief account of this animal. In Germany, in 1103, the right of hunting beaver was conferred along with other special hunting privileges, and a bull of Pope Lucius III in 1182 gave to a monastery all the beaver found within the bounds of its property. A royal edict issued at Berlin in March 1725 insisted upon the protection of beaver. Before the white man came, beaver, Castor canadensis, were widely distributed over North America, perhaps more widely than any other animal. The beaver population was large and probably was densest to the southwest of Hudson Bay and around the headwaters of the Missouri and Columbia rivers. Their scantiest population areas in the United States appear to have been southern Florida and the lower Mississippi Valley. This scantiness is attributed by early explorers to the aggressiveness of the alligators. All the southern half of Mexico appears to have been without a beaver population, but elsewhere over North America, wherever there were deciduous trees and water, and in a few treeless places where there were only water and grass, the beaver were found. Along the thousands of smaller streams throughout North America, there was colony after colony, dam after dam, in close succession, as many as 300 beaver ponds to the mile. Lewis and Clark mentioned the fact that near the Three Forks, Montana, the stream stretched away in a succession of beaver ponds as far as the eye could reach. The statements made by the early explorers, settlers, and trappers, together with my own observation, which commenced in 1885 and which have extended pretty well over the country from northern Mexico into Alaska, lead to the conclusion that the beaver population of North America at the beginning of the 17th century was upwards of 100 million. The area occupied was approximately 6 million square miles, and probably 200 beaver population per square mile would be a conservative number for the general average. In the United States, there are a number of counties and more than 100 streams and lakes named for the beaver. Upwards of 50 post offices are plain Beaver, Beaver Pond, Beaver Meadow, or some other combination that proclaims the former prevalence of this widely distributed builder. The beaver is the national emblematic animal of Canada, and there too numerous post offices, lakes, and streams are named for the beaver. Beaver skins lured the hunter and trapper over all American wilds. These skins were one of the earliest mediums of exchange among the settlers of North America. For 200 years, they were one of the most important exports, and for a longer time, they were also the chief commodity of trade on the frontier. A beaver skin was not only the standard by which other skins were measured in value, but also the standard of value by which guns, sugar, cattle, hatchets, and clothing were measured. Though freely used by the early settlers for clothing, they were especially valuable as raw material for the manufacture of hats, and for this purpose were largely exported. From this animal were prepared many remedies which in former times were believed to have high medicinal value. Castoreum was the most popular of these, and from it was compounded the great cure-all. The skin of the beaver was thought to be an excellent preventative of colic and consumption. The fat of the beaver efficient in apoplexy and epilepsy, to stop spasms, and for various afflictions of the nerves. Powdered beaver teeth were often given in soup for the prevention of many diseases. The castoreum of the beaver was considered a most efficient remedy for earache, deafness, headache, and gout, for the restoring of the memory and the cure of insanity. Next in importance to its skin, the beaver was valued for the castoreum it yielded. The old hunters, trappers, and first settlers forecast with confidence the weather from the actions of the beaver. This animal was credited with being weather-wise to a high degree. From his actions, the nature of the oncoming winter was predicted, and plans to meet it were made accordingly. Faith in the beaver's actions and activities as a basis for weather forecasting was almost absolute. If the beaver began work early, the winter was to begin early. If the beaver laid up a large harvest, covered the house deeply with mud, and raised the water level of the pond, the winter was, of course, to be a long and severe one. Extensive autumn rambles in the mountains with a special attention to beaver customs compels me to conclude that as a basis for weather prediction, beaverdom is not reliable. In the course of one autumn month in the mountains of Colorado, more than 100 colonies were observed. In many colonies, work for the winter commenced early. In others, only a few miles distant, preparations for the winter did not begin until late. In some, extensive preparations were made for the winter. In a few, the harvest laid up was exceedingly small. Thus, in 1 month of the same year, I saw some beaver colonies preparing for a long winter and others for a short one, many preparing for a hard winter and others almost unprepared for winter. From these varied and conflicting prognostications, how is one accurately to forecast the coming winter? The old prophets in one colony frequently disagreed with aged prophets who were similarly situated, but in a neighboring colony. At one place, 30 or more beaver gathered an enormous quantity of food, sufficient in fact to have supplied twice that number for the longest and most severe winter. The winter which followed was as mild a one as had passed over the Rocky Mountains in 50 years. Not 1/10 of the big food pile was eaten. I have not detected anything that indicates that the beaver ever planned for an especially hard winter. Goodly preparations are annually made for winter. Apparently, the extent of the preparation in any colony is dependent almost entirely upon the number of beaver that are to winter in that colony. Winter preparations consist of gathering the food harvest, repairing and sometimes raising the dam, and commonly covering the house with a layer of mud. Beaver display forethought, intelligence, and even wisdom, but being weather-wise is not one of their successful specialties. Local beaver now and then show unusual activity, and unusually large supplies are gathered and stored for the winter. This kind of work appears to be local, not general. The cases in which unusually large preparations were made for the winter could have been traced to an increased population of the colony that showed these activities. On the other hand, colonies with less preparations one year than on the preceding one probably had suffered a decrease of population. Increase of population in a beaver colony may be accounted for through the growing up of youngsters or by the arrival of immigrants, or both. Where the temporary inactivity of trappers in one locality might allow the beaver colony in that region to increase in numbers, or where the beaver population of that colony might be increased by the arrival of beaver driven from their homes by aggressive hunters and trappers in adjoining localities. At any rate, in the beaver world, some colonies each year commence work earlier than do others, and some colonies make extensive preparations for the winter, while others make but little preparation. This preparation appears to be determined chiefly by the number of colonists and the needs of the colony. The beaver hastened, if it did not bring, the settlement of the country. Hunters and trappers blazed the trails, described the natural resources, and lured the permanent settlers to possess the land and build homes among the ruins left by the beaver. Early in the fur industry, companies were formed, the Hudson's Bay Company becoming the most influential and best known. Its charter was granted by Charles II of England on the 2nd day of May, 1669. This company finally developed into one of the greatest commercial enterprises that America has ever known. The skin of the beaver furnished more than half its revenue. There are many features in the history of this company that have never been surpassed in any land. For more than 200 years it held absolute sway over a country larger than Europe, and for the first 150 years of its existence it was the government of the territory where it ruled, and thus determined the social and other standards of life within that territory. One of the early officials of this company declared that they were on the ground ahead of the missionaries, and said that the initials HBC on the banner of the company might well be interpreted as "Here before Christ." Kingsford's History of Canada says that in the 18th century, Canada exported a moderate quantity of timber, wheat, the herb called ginseng, and a few other commodities, but from first to last she lived chiefly on beaver skins. Horace T. Martin, formerly Secretary of Agriculture for Canada, calls the beaver's part in Canadian development, quote, "a subject which has from the inception of civilization been associated with the industrial and commercial development, and indirectly with the social life, the romance, and to a considerable extent the wars of Canada." End quote. The American Fur Company and the Northwestern Fur Company were two large fur-gathering enterprises whose trappers ranged afar and who left their mark in the history and the development of the Northwest. The colossal Astor fortune really had its beginning in the wealth which John Jacob Astor amassed chiefly through the gathering and the sale of beaver skins. Beaver skins are now economically unimportant in commerce, but their value has already led to the establishment of a few beaver farms. Today, beaver are apparently extinct over the greater portion of the area which they formerly occupied, and are scarce over the remaining inhabited area. Scattered colonies are found in the Rocky Mountains and in the mountains of the Pacific coast, and there are localities in Canada where they are still fairly abundant. In many places in the Grand Canyon of the Colorado they are common. A few are found in Michigan and Maine. Some years ago, a few brooks in the Adirondacks were successfully colonized with these useful animals. They have reappeared in Pennsylvania, and there probably are straggling beaver all over the United States, which, if protected, would increase. There is a growing sentiment in favor of allowing the beaver to multiply. In 1877, Missouri passed a law protecting these animals. So did Maine in 1885 and Colorado in 1899. Other states, to the total of 24, have also legislated for their protection. The Canadian government has also passed protective laws. A noticeable increase has already occurred in a few localities. Beaver multiply rapidly under protection, as is shown in the national parks of both Canada and the United States.